Hello YouTube, Bane 666 here. So today I want to relate a story which happened maybe about 10 years ago and involves a conversation I had with someone. And hopefully this video will really illustrate the importance of being a skeptic and not just believing things for the sake of believing them. So I used to teach, and about 10 years ago I had a student who I will call Steve. And Steve was, I think, maybe about 37, 38 at the time. And he was a good guy. He was a good student. He was pleasant to other students. He was very helpful. He was a nice guy. I had very little complaints about Steve. And he is also quite intelligent and quite logical, except when it came to one particular thing. You see, Steve was a conspiracy theorist. And not just your normal run-of-the-mill, believe in one or two little kind of conspiracies. Steve believed in everything. Every single fucking conspiracy you could think of. He would routinely bring in discs filled with these documentaries. He would download it and watch from the internet and insist that I look at them. And I'd go home and I'd watch them and come back and tell him why I thought they were bullshit and debunk them, and we'd have some interesting conversations. Like I said, he wasn't a bad guy, and we disagreed about the conspiracy stuff quite a bit, but he never became openly hostile or anything like that. But like I said, he believed in a lot. He's the type of guy that would show you a picture of the moon, the surface of the moon, which had been put through Photoshop filters, so it was incredibly pixelated to the point where there were odd shapes which weren't in the original photo, and then claim that this is an alien dome on the moon, or weird rock formations on the surface of Mars is the remnants of a alien monorail system or something, which somehow has been petrified and turned into stone, or some crazy fucking crap. He was forever coming out with this shit. But the story revolves around one particular conversation one day. I would normally get to class early, and he got there early this particular morning. And he asked me the question, have I ever seen 2001 A Space Odyssey? And I said, of course. And he said, do you remember the giant alien monolith they found on the moon? And I said, yeah, of course. And he said, do you realise that's real? At which point my curiosity got the better of me, and I said, go on, explain to me how that's real. And he said, apparently a NASA Black Ops team on the moon found 3 alien beacons, which were these giant monoliths, and for some unknown reason they transported them from the surface of the moon down to the surface of the Earth, without anyone noticing, of course. Well, most people not noticing. And they placed 2 in the Canadian wilderness and the 3rd in the middle of Greenland. Yeah, which makes perfect sense. If I found 3 giant alien beacons on the moon, that's the first thing I would do. I'd put 2 in Canada and 1 in Greenland for some reason. So I asked him how he knew this. Why do you think this is real, Steve? I said. And he said, you can see them on Google Maps. Now remember, this is 10 years ago, so the Google Maps back then is a bit different than it is now. The images and the program has been upgraded a lot since then. But he told me the rough locations, and I had a look, and yes, you could see 3 long black shapes. So I've managed to hunt down these 3 long black shapes, and this is them. So, like I said, you can't find these on the newer Google Maps, so, don't bother having a look. But 10 years ago, you could actually find these things. And the first thing I did is I zoomed in and I had a close look at them to see exactly what they are. Now, the way Google Maps was made back then, and I'm assuming it's pretty much the same now, is basically they took satellite images, I'm guessing millions of satellite images, and they put them all together like a giant jigsaw puzzle, all the pieces being roughly square. But because the images are taken by different satellites at different times, they don't always line up. Now, in some shots back then, you could see a line, and on one side it would be summer, and on the other side it would be winter, and you can tell because there would be ice and snow, and then there'd just be like a line, and above that there would be no ice and snow, which doesn't make any sense, right? Unless, of course, you realise that this is millions of images being put together by different satellites, taken at different times of year, like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And as a consequence of that, sometimes you get mapping errors. Now, these three big, long, black rectangles that Steve showed me were, in fact, mapping errors. You could actually see the lines where the different photos were joined together. And this is just a gap, that simple. So I explained this to Steve, and he laughed at it. He thought that was an idiotic explanation, despite the fact you can see the tiles, you can see the photos and the way they're placed together. And he insisted that if this was in fact just mapping errors and not three giant alien monoliths from the moon, then I should be able to find other mapping errors, which I did. I found short, square ones and long, thin ones, and there was quite a few. And I showed these to him. Some of the long, thin ones, for example, there was no doubt whatsoever that they were mapping errors. They were just too physically big to be an object. So he looked at this information, and with a straight face, he said to me, "Yeah, but those are just mapping errors." Oh, I see. So the three that he showed me aren't mapping errors. They're actually alien objects from the moon. But the other ones, that's calling them mapping errors is perfectly reasonable. Yeah. So it was pretty obvious that I wasn't getting anywhere with this line of arguing. So I decided to try a different tact. I said, "Steve, these objects are obviously extremely big." He said yes. I said, "Why is it that no one's ever seen them? Surely people must be seeing these things, right? Because they're pretty massive." And he told me they're in the middle of nowhere and that there is a Black Ops secret Illuminati team stationed there to keep people away. Of course there is. That's exactly what I would do if I took three alien monoliths from the moon and put them in the Canadian wilderness. I'd station my Black Ops teams there to keep people out, right? Even though these things are so big, people could see them at a great distance. So the Black Ops teams would be rather useless. Plus, why are they helicoptered in each day, or are they living there in tents? Do they have bungalows or something? I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere. How do these Black Ops teams survive? How often do they rotate out? I'm just curious. Of course, he couldn't answer any of these questions. I said, "Why hasn't anyone seen these alien monoliths from the air? Surely planes must have gone near these things at some point, and someone's looked down and gone, geez, that's a giant alien monolith from the moon. I wonder what that's doing there." And he then told me that they're invisible. And I said, "Okay, if they're invisible, why are you showing me supposed images of them on Google Maps?" And he said, "Because they absorb light." Okay, that would be why they're black. And he said, "Yeah, and that's why they're invisible." And we then had this amazing conversation where he would explain that they're invisible because they absorb light, which isn't how invisibility works, but anyway. But at the same time, they're black because they absorb light, which is why we can see them from the satellite photos. And even though these two things completely contradict each other, they somehow worked in his mind, and he would just cross back and forth between each one whenever it was convenient. It was amazing to watch. It really was. So obviously I wasn't getting anywhere with this line of thought. So I asked another question. I said, how do you know all this, Steve? How do you know that these things came from the moon and have been transported down and are now being kept in the Canadian wilderness and Greenland, of course? And he said he found out from Dr. Richard Boylan. Now, I'm guessing most of you have never heard of Dr. Richard Boylan, and this was the first time I'd ever heard of him as well. So I did a little bit of research on him on the internet, and I found out that Dr. Richard Boylan is in fact a psychologist. Well, not exactly. He's a former psychologist, as he lost his license.
Former California psychologist who had his state psychology license revoked over allegations of improper sexual interaction with female patients in his hot tub, hydrotherapy? Claims to have been the confidant of the late government MJ-12 insider Michael Wolff, another proven fraud. Boylan now conveniently claims to have been gifted with a brand new and, no surprise, anonymous inside source. Also rode the American Indian Star People mythos for several years and claims to know of secret government UFO testing spots in Nevada desert. Has engaged in countless character assassinations against UFO researchers who disagree with him. Is now planning to hold a summer camp for star kids, children who are alleged to have been genetically altered by aliens, aka, money in my pocket. Parents everywhere should beware. See transcript of California Board of Psychology revoking Boylan's license to practice.
Nothing like a little bit of controversial hot tub therapy in the middle of your therapy session, is there? So anyway, let's have a look at the court documents.
Although initially DW was reluctant to try hypnosis, respondent encouraged her to do so to retrieve memories of abuse. During their fifth session, on January 7, 1992, respondent performed DW's first memory enhancement hypnosis. They covered sexual abuse at age 4 by DW's mother and at age 4 to 5 by her father. Other sessions involving hypnosis followed on occasion, with further recall of childhood sexual abuse and possible ritualistic abuse. In late winter or early spring of 1992, DW listened to a radio talk show about abductions by aliens and the use of hypnosis. At a therapy session, DW asked respondent somewhat flippantly if he thought these people may have been abused and confused about the memory. Respondent, with a serious face, responded that he thought it might be just the opposite. In the same session, respondent said that he had some patients who may have had extraterrestrial, ET, experiences and he was doing some research on the subject.
Call me crazy, but suggesting to a patient during a therapy session about childhood abuse that maybe they had actually been kidnapped by aliens instead and the sexual abuse was a false memory or something. You know, maybe that's not the most professional thing to do. Call me crazy, I know. Maybe I'm being too hard on the guy, right? But I know why you're here. I know why you've stuck around. You want to find out about the controversial hot tub therapy. And to be honest, I can't really blame you.
About halfway through her therapy with respondent, he invited DS to spend a day at Harbin Hot Springs with him, his wife and a few other patients. The trip would be billed as a regular therapy session and involve certain exercises and soaking in the hot springs in the nude. The purpose of the trip was for the patients to improve self-esteem and see their bodies as good. Respondent told DS. The trip would help her heal by becoming comfortable with her body and her sexuality. DS declined respondent's invitation because she was not comfortable being nude in front of people she did not know. Respondent repeated the invitation a few times, and each time DS declined. After a break of a few months, respondent indicated that there would be a second date scheduled for the trip. He again invited DS and she accepted the invitation because she wanted to heal, but felt stressed and anxious. The night before the trip, DS left a message for respondent that she could not go. While respondent believes that there is nothing intrinsically erotic or wrong with nudity, he also had no understanding that others, and in particular his patients here, might not be as comfortable as he in nudity with others. While he may not have had a sexual motivation, these patients considered at least some of his actions to raise sexual issues. Respondent showed an incredible lack of insight in failing to appreciate the distress he caused these patients.
Geez, pressuring sexual assault victims to get naked in a hot tub with you for a special type of therapy. I mean, what could go wrong there? Clearly, this poor man is innocent. Now, best case scenario for Richard Boylan is that he's absolutely clueless and doesn't understand that maybe sexual assault victims wouldn't want to get naked in a hot tub with him. Worst case scenario, though, he is a creep and maybe a sexual predator. Who knows? Either way, it's not really that good. So I showed Steve this information and said, maybe this guy isn't all that credible. Maybe you want to look into him a little bit more. Maybe take what he's saying to you with a grain of salt. Maybe keep an open mind. And Steve's response was, well, they've just discredited him because they're afraid of him. Yeah, of course. The Illuminati have come after this Dr. Richard Boylan, which no one's ever heard of, and destroyed his career because of the stuff he's talking about UFOs. It has nothing to do with the hot tub therapy, of course. I guess you could say that maybe no one's ever heard of him because they destroyed his career. I mean, it didn't really stop him talking about UFOs and stuff, though, did it? Although Dick Boylan does have some other things to say about the government making attempts on his life to keep him quiet.
You mean going public with this
yes.
Star Nations information?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you, I've had a couple of repercussions since I've gotten this information and started putting it out. Very shortly after I got this information, my wife and I went on a little trip, and someone sabotaged one of the rear tires on our truck. So we were tooling along about 75 miles an hour on the interstate down in Southern California, out in the desert, and one tire was empty. Luckily, we had duals on the rear axle, and tire was totally shredded, but the other one held the weight, and we didn't careen off the highway into the side.
My God, Rich, you could have gotten killed if you had a single tire.
Yeah, definitely could have rolled. Then we've had some other stuff happen too, but that was the most dramatic. And of course, a lot of hate mail from the operatives who work for the cabal and don't want this out and do intimidation stuff.
Hate mail from the operatives that work for the cabal. Remember that, because that's very important for the end of this story. But let's be fair for a minute, and let's be truly skeptical and ask the question, could he be telling the truth? Is it possible in any conceivable way that a government might discredit someone and spread lies about them in an attempt to silence them? The answer is yes, it is possible. As a men's rights activist, I know all about people spreading lies and propaganda about you. Not the government, but definitely the media in this case. So yeah, it is possible that the government might be doing something like that. The next question we should be asking is it probable is it likely that the government would target this guy and try to discredit him and destroy his career, and even attempt to kill him by, giving him a flat tire? Because, flat tires never happen, right? Unless it's the cabal trying to kill someone. A tire's never blown by itself. We all know that, don't we, Richard? But is it likely they would target him and try to silence him? I would have to say no. This guy, in my opinion, is a crackpot, right? When he's looking at Google Maps and claiming that they're beacons from the moon, I don't think they would be wasting their time trying to silence him. Or kill him, for that matter, by giving him a flat tire. Now, if we're going to look at all possibilities, which, is something we should do, we should look at everything and consider it. There is another explanation as well. He could, in fact, be working for the secret, hidden underground Illuminati, which no one knows about but everyone speaks about on the internet. And he could be working for them, and he could be actually trying to discredit the entire UFO community. Now, I don't believe that either. I think the much simpler explanation of him being a crackpot is the one to go with. And a key piece of information about why I think that is at the end. That's at the end of the story. I'm not going to spoil it by telling you now, but there is one other thing I can tell you now, and unfortunately I couldn't find the interview in which he said it. I remember hearing it on YouTube back in 2012. I'm not sure when the actual interview was recorded though, and I looked for it for an hour or so earlier today but could not find it. Richard Boylan was talking to the guy from I think it's called Coast to Coast, a radio show where they talk about all this conspiracy stuff. And Boylan was talking about an upcoming UFO conference thing. It's like a Comic-Con, but with UFO nuts. And he said that he heard that some aliens might be there in disguise as pot plants. I'm not joking. I swear I'm not making that up. He actually said that there might be aliens there in disguise as pot plants. I ask you, why would the government try to silence this guy or kill him when he's coming out with shit like that? Yeah, he's just a crackpot. But as I'm talking about the alien beacons from the moon, I think we should just have a quick look at his actual words on that, because when I was searching for images for this video, I actually found his site with his information. So let's have a quick look at that, and then I'll get back to the story about Steve.
Additional information about the space beacons, recently restored to space. On September 9, 2007, the third of 3 space beacons was restored to their rightful position in space after they had been stolen and brought to Earth around 1972. The extraction operation involved Colonel Shadow.
Colonel Shadow? Really? Wasn't he part of G.I. Joe? I'm sure he was. Look, okay. This is obviously very serious because the government was trying to kill him over this information. So I shouldn't laugh. I should be taking it very seriously. So okay, I'm gonna get control and take this very, very seriously, because it's obviously very important information which you need to hear.
The extraction operation involved Colonel Shadow and his counter-insurgency team providing defense against cabal mercenaries surrounding the beacons, as well as star nations providing the technical expertise and personnel to lift the beacons back into space. The beacons have some internal energy systems and intelligent guidance systems to interact with other objects in space, including Earth. They are not just inert lighthouses. Ancient ancestors of the current Star Nation civilizations had constructed and placed in space a network of space beacons which would facilitate navigation and position finding across the galaxy. 3 of the space beacons were positioned within our solar system. At least one of them had been spotted by Apollo astronauts during flights to the Moon. These 30-mile-long black rectangular beacons look somewhat like the monolith in Arthur C. Clarke's novel movie, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Not a coincidence. Clarke was a CIA asset and knowledgeable. In 1972, the Cabal, covetous of the advanced technology these beacons utilize, had secret military astronauts go into space and retrieve first one, and later the other 2 space beacons. These they ultimately placed in remote snowy locations in Nunavut Territory, Canada, in Greenland, and astride the Alaska-Yukon Territory boundary. These beacons exert powerful electromagnetic fields which disrupt Earth's natural energy lines and grids, have altered the weather, and have been used by the Cabal to focus energy in undisclosed ways. Earlier in mid-2007, the extraction of these beacons from Earth began. The dates were: Space Beacon No. 1 Nunavut Territory on July 18, 2007. Space Beacon No. 2 Greenland on August 14, 2007. On September 9, 2007, ex-NSA Colonel Shadow and his counter-insurgency team CIT helped provide security for an operation in which the Zeta came down and extracted the 3rd and final space beacon back into space. They did so amid withering fire from Cabal mercenaries ordered to prevent the beacon from leaving Cabal grasp. The Colonel sustained a superficial flesh wound, which he minimized, as well as many rounds to his chest, but protected by body armor. Others in his CIT also took hits to their bulletproof vests. Now that these beacons are back in their natural positions in space, the equilibrium of electromagnetic forces in local space and on Earth is restored. Star Nations is grateful for this, as is Mother Earth. And so should be we all. Because satellite imagery is only updated occasionally, you can still see these beacons where they rested before extraction on Google Satellite Imagery.
Okay, let's quickly break some of this down before moving back to the story. So, in his own words, Richard Boylan says that these monoliths, these beacons, were 30 miles long. Now, to give you some idea of the size of these things, Manhattan Island is 13.4 miles long. So these moon monoliths were over twice the length of Manhattan Island. And apparently they were brought down in 1972 and placed in 3 locations and stayed there for 35 years. And in 35 years, no one saw one or took a picture or saw one from a plane and thought, what the fuck's that? Sounds like a legit story to me. I can't pick any faults with it. I don't know why anyone would doubt Richard Boylan. But anyway, back to the story with Steve. So I thought about it, and I thought the best way, I guess, to try to debunk this to Steve was to go with the original argument, because I could actually show evidence with that. Even though he had rejected it earlier, I thought it's worth giving it another try. So I asked him again, why is it that these other mapping errors are mapping errors? You're okay with that. But when it comes to these 3, you're adamant that they're not mapping errors. What is the difference between them? And his answer was extremely interesting. You see, often when people hang on to an ideology or an irrational thought or idea or whatever, it is because they have possibly a key piece of information which they believe is 100% true, and they hang on to that key piece of information so tightly because they're so convinced that it is accurate that they won't even consider anything else. I had a conversation on Twitter with a feminist earlier this week who was claiming that men don't have less rights than women, even though I pointed out bodily integrity. He just laughed at it and ignored it, because in his mind, the idea of men being having less rights, or in other words, being less privileged in some areas than women, is just insane. It's insane to that guy. It was like I was telling him the Earth is flat or gravity doesn't exist. That's how he was reacting, because he was so invested in that assumption, that idea, which is actually easy to prove wrong. And it's exactly the same way with Steve. Steve had made an assumption that all three black shapes on the map were exactly the same size, exactly the same shape, and all on exactly the same angle. Now, to be fair, they are all on a similar angle, and this can be explained by satellites, right? They orbit the Earth in certain ways, or at least some satellites do. So it wouldn't be surprising that that some of the images would be taken from a similar orbit, and therefore be on a similar angle. But it would be a bit strange if all the shapes were exactly the same size and shape, right? There was no differences, because mapping errors should be random. Now, I guess you could say the photos from the satellites would be of a similar size. That's an assumption. I think it's a fairly safe assumption. So you could argue that some mapping errors might be of similar size and shape, but they shouldn't be exactly the same. And Steve was convinced that they were exactly the same size and shape. So I put the three images in Photoshop and made them transparent, and put one over the other, and showed him that in fact they weren't all the same size and shape. You know, one was fatter, one was longer, you get the idea. And this actually stopped him in his tracks. He actually paused and considered this. For the first time in the entire conversation, he considered the fact that he might be wrong, because this key assumption, which his entire belief hung on, suddenly didn't seem that strong anymore. Now, he wasn't willing to say that it was bullshit, that it was mapping errors, but you know, he was considering that maybe they're mapping errors. So what he decided to do was to write a letter off to Richard Boylan, who apparently he was in regular contact with, and ask him about this. This is where the story gets very, very interesting. I think it was maybe a week later I received an email from Steve, which had Boylan's response as well as Steve's response to Boylan. Boylan was extremely angry. He accused me of being some government shill whose only purpose was to discredit Boylan, you know, this great man who was just trying to bring the truth to the world. I've since been accused by another lunatic of being an FBI agent. So I guess that's the standard response for lunatics, right? If you actually question anything that they come out with, they just accuse you of being a shill, or you know, a government agent or whatever, trying to spread disinformation, and they don't actually deal with the actual claim. But he was extremely angry in this email. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it. This was 10 years ago and on a long dead computer. He then told Steve that if Steve was going to believe this stuff, that he never wanted contact with him again. Basically, Steve was being excommunicated from the cult. And that's exactly what it was like. It was a cult mentality. If you dare to question Richard Boylan, you are kicked out of the cult forever. And once again, let me stress, he was extremely angry about this. Now, it was a perfectly reasonable question for Steve to bring up, right? Could these be mapping errors? Could it be a mistake? Could it be false? It certainly seems that way. That's what the evidence suggests. I mean, where's the counter evidence that it's not, right? This was a polite inquiry by Steve towards someone he respected, and what he got was just abuse and accusations and threats. And the really sad thing about this was Steve's response. Steve grovelled and begged for forgiveness and swore that he would never question Richard Boylan again. It was just fucking sad and pathetic. So, you know, I don't know if Richard Boylan is a nut job or whether he is a con man. The outrageous claims he makes me think that maybe he's just a nut job, right? I think if he was a con man, his bullshit would be a little bit more believable, but who knows? Who knows, really? I mean, there's obviously some people out there who are willing to believe this shit. Maybe he's a nut job who enjoys conning people. I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of the two. Either way, I don't really care. He's someone to be avoided and definitely not believed. Now, just before I finish this video, I should point out that even though I'm extremely skeptical towards the UFO community, I'm always open to having my mind changed by legitimate evidence. I mean, it's an extremely big universe out there, and it would be strange if we're the only life in the entire universe. I suspect that, you know, there is an abundance of life throughout the universe. Now, that doesn't mean that the majority of that life is intelligent. It doesn't mean that that life has figured out a way to cross the vastness of space and visit us. And it doesn't mean that they even know we're here. But it's not an impossible thing. I'm not willing to totally rule it out. I mean, if you go back 100 years, who would have thought that you could hold a device in the palm of your hand and talk to someone on the other side of the world? Yet that's an everyday thing now. So maybe, you know, in 200 years, maybe 50 years, we would discover a way of crossing the vastness of space in a very short period of time. Maybe that will become an everyday thing. But at the level of technology we're at now, it doesn't really seem realistic or possible. And any claim of aliens or extraterrestrials or UFOs or whatever, I'm going to be very skeptical about. We all should be skeptical about such claims. Doesn't mean we rule them out without looking at them, right? We should at least look at them and falsify them and see if there's any other explanations, which in my experience there usually is. But, you know, we should keep an open mind. But let me stress, keeping an open mind doesn't mean believing any bullshit that's put before you, right? Any and all bullshit, I should say, which is exactly what a lot of people do. They just swallow the whole lot and don't care to falsify, don't want to falsify, because they like the idea. And I can understand that on some level. I think it would be cool if we suddenly came in contact with another alien species or something. I mean, it would be the most significant event in our lifetime, right? You'd be hard-pressed to find something that would top that. But just because you like the idea of something and possibly want it to happen doesn't mean that you should stop any and all critical thinking towards information and evidence presented to you.
Why you, Richard? I mean, have you tried to answer that or resolve that for yourself? Why you, and how did this telepathic message come to you? I mean, did it just come in a dream? Did you get a funny feeling? What happened?
Well, I've been in dialogue with some people in a team that also worked on helping this hearing happen earlier that nailed the cabal for their misdeeds. So I've gotten a combination of telepathic messages from others and my own readings on that come together to put this message together, and I've gotten indications, as I say, from other associates and from Chief Golden Eagle as well. And The why me? I can't say in an absolutist sense. I do know that they've kind of tagged me as the representative for Earth to speak with their counselors, the High Council, if you will.
Well, you have not met them yet, though, have you?
Yes. I have met several of them.
Wait a minute. You're holding back on me now, Richard. When did this happen?
Well, I took a trip and was in their presence. They have not manifested in a physically separate way, but their energy field is there, and they've in some cases used a person to communicate through, use their voice box to communicate through. The thing here is that they said that Earth is about 2 ticks below the developmental level that they usually have as the minimum level of cultural and social development in a planetary society for them to bother with. We're about 2 ticks below that, but because there is a unique and kind of intriguing potential in humans, spiritual and even psychic giftedness, potentials, and enough intelligence that they felt that an exception would be made to the usual, well, pass them by and go on to some other planet that's worth saving that isn't so far gone. And so Earth has not been accepted into the Star Nation's family of inhabited worlds yet, designating a human representative. Myself at the moment, I hear that there are a couple of youngsters, a boy and a girl star kid, that are into their late grade school years and teens respectively, that are going to be council representatives down the line. But at the moment, I'm the kind of designated hitter for this communication. But Earth is had to be talked to to get this ball rolling of turning things around and give us hope and give us an understanding of what had to happen in the past over 40 years ago to get enough of a past cleared to raise consciousness. We're at a whole different. Well, I took a trip and was in their presence. Well, I took a trip and was in their presence. I took a trip and I took a trip and well, I took a trip and was in their presence. I took a trip and I took a trip and I took a trip and well, I took a trip and was in their presence.